So we've saved the what might be our most important panel for last. And to help us explore this topic deeply, we've asked Ajoy Vase to moderate this session and to introduce his fellow panelists. So take it away, Ajoy.
Thanks, Paul. Welcome everybody to our session on getting and keeping our intentions straight, conversation about ethics and bias in AI and education. I'm joined by the excellent Cassandra Herring and Adam Kalai, and we're going to take you all home. So just a quick, hoping for a really robust, thought-provoking discussion, but just a quick note that we'll get Adam and Cassandra to share a little bit about their backgrounds. We'll dive into a couple of topics, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. And so we just encourage you all to contribute to that. More participation equals more fun. So just to get us started, I'm excited about this group because I think we bring really different perspectives and expertise to this conversation. And so maybe to kick us off, Adam and Cassandra, it'd be great to hear what you're bringing with you when it comes to thinking about AI, education, ethics, and bias. And so I'll kick it over to you. Just introduce yourself and say what you're bringing to this conversation. Cassandra, you want to get us started?
Sure. Cassandra Herring. I am bringing several different hats, so to speak, to this conversation. Obviously, the first one being that I'm a career educator. I've overseen Head Start programs and all the way through doctoral dissertation. So I've worked at every level of education and have an unwavering commitment to equity in the educational space. I'll say, secondly, I'm cautiously optimistic about technology in the education space. I believe in the power and potential of AI in education, as long as we are cognizant and intentional about the guardrails that will help us do no harm to children. And then lastly, I'll say I'm a parent who has sort of peered into the online virtual spaces and classrooms of children, elementary and high school, over the last 10 months, and bring from that experience also a different lens, maybe, on the conversation we're having today. I think those are probably the three hats that I'm energizing today.
Thanks, Cassandra.
Great. Yeah, I'm Adam Kalai. I'm a machine learning researcher, and I also work on crowdsourcing. I've also been a professor, but for the last 10 years, I've been at Microsoft Research in a very nice interdisciplinary lab. So even though I was sort of just thinking about algorithms and machine learning, I've been surrounded by social scientists and economists, people with different perspectives. And I've also been working and running across various aspects of bias in machine learning algorithms that I'll be able to talk about later. But I kind of come with a perspective of a algorithm designer, a naive person using machine learning, who's trying to become more aware of the harms that it can cause.
Thanks, Adam. And just from my side, I'm bringing several years of teaching experience to the table, as well as community organizing. And most recently, time spent in philanthropy, knitting together teams of researchers, community members, technologists, and educators to work on shared projects with the idea that education, technology, and research have the power to benefit us, but they don't always do because we don't organize. And so just lessons from that experience, I think, I'm hoping will enrich this conversation. So, just to set the stage a little bit, this isn't the first time that we've had a promising technology with the ability to have incredible positive impact on the world, nor is it the first time that as a collective, we're experiencing and aware of deep structural inequities present in our society that really hamper that technology from having the positive impact. We've had the Industrial Revolution, we've had nuclear power, we've had high energy physics, we've had biotech, and obviously we've had high tech. And so we've got a lot of examples to look back on of things that offered promise but didn't necessarily deliver. And as I stepped back before this conversation and thought about why is that, right? As human beings, we kind of do that to ourselves. I thought about a couple of different issues. The first one being that I'd love both of you to speak to. So the first one's access and ownership. So when we have something that's cutting edge, who has access to it and who owns it? And then the second one is, how do we think about intended or unintended harms that might result? And I think both of you are just really well poised to help us tackle those questions. And let's start maybe with access and ownership. So Cassandra, I'd love to hear your thoughts around what you're seeing with respect to access and ownership in AI that's concerning you or that's giving you hope.
Yeah.
Share a little bit with us.
Well, I mean, I think Tess in her presentation just beautifully laid the groundwork for this conversation in terms of who are the players within the AI space, and how are we holding ourselves accountable and being intentional around ensuring that there is a diversity of players in the AI space. I'm going to borrow sort of the statement from the Algorithmic Justice League, where they talk about equitable and accountable AI. They say we want the world to remember that who codes matters, how we code matters, and that we can code a better future. And what I love about that is by focusing on the diversity of developers, of other team members, ensuring that there's a diversity of educators that are coming together around a common problem. I would argue start with the problem or the question and then get to the data. We've heard a lot about leading with the data first today, but if we're starting with the problem and the question and we ensure that there are diversity of voices, then we stand to produce a better outcome that a variety of folks can take ownership in. And here when I'm talking about diversity, I'm not just talking about racial ethnic diversity. I'm also talking about the diversity of experience, right? There's a common refrain. Obviously, Branch Ed, my organization, works with teachers across the country. And there's a common refrain that teachers teach the way they were taught. Well, that exposure to a diversity of experiences and perspectives can only help us create AI that then can be accessible and meaningful to a wide variety of users. And I think that that's a powerful thing that we have to think about when we think about access and ownership. The second one around how we write code matters, I think is really important. I think we have to be mindful that we can intentionally or inadvertently bake in bias that is a mirror on our society, but perhaps not the society that we necessarily want to own or to continue to perpetuate. So thinking intentionally about how can we begin to eradicate bias in our systems, both be aware of it, name it, and then figure out what are those mitigating strategies against it, I think is also crucial, right, at the development stage and throughout the AI process. And being able to do that means that you can't be in your own silo, right? You need to have partners that can see into your blind spots and can help you solve for what might be coming up. And then lastly, just cautionary for me is this question around, will AI help close the digital divides that we're currently dealing with, or will it allow those divides to manifest into even larger chasms across our society? Will we, in essence, find ourselves with sort of two digital divides? So those that don't have access or don't have literacy around understanding the power and possibility of these systems, then locking themselves out of the ability to inform or influence them. I'll stop there.
No, you brought up a number of things, Cassandra. I'll follow up with a quick question on one of them, which is on this last point of the threat of or the risk of increasing the divide, multiple levels of divides, right? Because we have people in the same country, this is America. We have people that don't have internet, and we have people that are developing super cutting edge AI algorithms, right? And that's true then globally on a whole other level. So then that leads to a challenge of, if only certain people have access to a cutting edge technology, then they have access to own it and own how it's created. How do we create the conditions for that broader ownership? I know that's not an easy question that any one of us can just answer, but I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think bringing more voices to the table, being able to demonstrate a greater good around using the technology, I think is important. I mean, something that you said, Ajoy, reminds me of one of the very opening conversations of the day around the teacherless education and the need for some countries to have instructional expertise where there might not be readily available teachers. I think that's the flip side of the coin for me is, are we experimenting with AI in vulnerable communities so that we're setting up a different kind of divide, right? Those who have human teachers and those who have not have technology. I don't think we want that either, right? I think that to me is also an equity issue. So I think it's complicated, but I guess my feeling is that we have to have a broader level of engagement throughout the AI development and deployment process so that we can interrogate these questions, not in our silos, but truly have a cross-fertilization trying to get to the answer.
Yeah, I think what I hear you alluding to with that, Cassandra, is rather than experimenting with technology on communities that can't afford humans,
right?
What we need to work toward is a world, instead of maybe AI should, instead of standing for artificial intelligence, should stand for augmented intelligence. That's about human and machine working together, right?
Yes.
And really augmenting the human experience so that, and I think the groups that I've seen do this well, that have been on the cutting edge of technology, have not ignored the importance of the human, right? So it's not about technology replacing a teacher or educator. It's about technology taking certain things off that educator's plate.
Absolutely.
Technology is better at doing, and letting the human connections, the human relationship building, all of that, freeing up time and space for that. I feel like that's the world you're talking about, which is very, very exciting.
Absolutely.
I want to pivot us just a little bit to talking about what happens when we let the technology lead, right? And some of the harms that we don't intend, but then just end up happening. And then hindsight's 2020, but we actually have the benefit at this moment of being able to have foresight and designing very carefully and deliberately. So Adam, I'd love to kind of bring you in to talk a little bit about the potential of harms, right? And how to avoid them. You've done some really interesting work around word embedding that's thrown up some of these risks, and would love for you to share a little bit about that.
Sure. I'd also like to say thank you for inviting me, by the way. This is a great opportunity to learn and to talk. So I can tell you a little bit about word embeddings. It's actually going to be much easier if I can just show you a little picture because it's a very visual concept. So if that's okay, tell me if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
We can't.
Can you see it? Am I there?
I think you might need to just double click.
Adam, do you want to share the whole desktop and see if that makes any difference?
Can anyone hear me?
Oh, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you. Just can't not see you.
It said Zoom quit unexpectedly. I apologize for that, but I guess it's back. I don't know.
Oh yeah, and we see you.
I'm gonna try one more time. Can you see my screen by any chance?
Not yet. It's just a black.
Starting.
There we go.
We see it.
All right. Well, don't blame me. I work in Microsoft. Zoom, not in my hands. But let me tell you a little bit about word embeddings, which are a technology that was popular, invented in the 90s and became very popular in the 2010s. And people got excited because basically the way it works, it's kind of like a dictionary for the computer. So the computer takes data from the web and trains a model. And then in that model, it represents each word not as a definition like we have in an English dictionary, but as a bunch of numbers. And you can imagine for a computer to understand words, it's much easier to have numbers because it can sort them and see which numbers are closer to each other and things like that. So it takes, remember, it takes data, just raw data. It could be news articles, it could be whatever from the internet. People have done it from Wikipedia, different sources, and it creates a table basically for each word. It has a bunch of numbers. And you can kind of plot these things. Now it's in hundreds of dimensions, but I'll show you in 2 dimensions because I can't show you more. And basically each word has some location. And as you can kind of imagine, as you might hope, the nearby words have similar meanings. So it plots, the numbers associated with 2 companies might be near each other, like Microsoft and Apple here. The numbers associated with people or cities might be near each other. And that's kind of a neat property. And another neat property that people really liked is that the computer kind of has there are these parallelograms. So there's these analogies that you can see with parallel edges. And so what it means is that computer can say an analogy like Bill Gates is to Steve Jobs as Microsoft is to, and then it can answer that analogy with Apple, almost like an SAT question. And it could do that for many different things. So people were very excited about them. So we asked a question, we said, so let's ask the computer to generate some analogies between the 2 words she and he. And this is only getting at binary gender, but that's what we can with the language for those pronouns. And so we asked for the analogies and the computer started generating bunches of analogies. And some of them were analogies people have talked about before that weren't unexpected, like sister and brother. And others were a little worse. So we asked it to generate them and it said he is to doctor like she is to nurse. And when we saw that, we realized that there's a major problem here. And then some of them, others it generated were also just terrible, like he is to computer programmer, like she is to homemaker. And when we saw the computer just generating them, again, all we gave the computer was the words he and she, and this is what it spit out. So it was kind of shocking, and it's already been correlated since to show that it's the biases and stereotypes that it has are very consistent with sort of human biases and the distribution of professions across gender. Some of them were interesting too. It would have she is to feminist, like he is to realist, or she is to pregnancy. Can anyone guess what the computer thought the male analogy of pregnancy was? It said kidney stone. So, so there are just all these awful biases, and what's worse is that these biases are used in so many different systems. Now we can kind of plot all the words on 2 dimensions, and we can see which words are closer to she and which words are closer to he. And again, here you can see a bunch of stereotypes, like she is closer to knitting, he is closer to genius. Now, one of the kind of interesting things you can do is you can change the numbers. So you can move things around. So here we can actually modify the words or the numbers associated with the words and try to make them all equally distant between he and she. Not that that's going to totally solve the problem, but at least the computer gives you an ability to kind of look at the biases, analyze the biases in a way that you might or might not, that's more difficult, let's say, with a human. Let's put it this way, the computer is kind of admitting its biases readily and putting them forward in a way that we can see them in a way that humans might be much more reluctant, or you'd have to do much more carefully controlled experiments to tease apart. And yes, these word embeddings, which I mentioned, became popular in the 2010s. It took many years before anyone thought of, of looking for bias in them. And that speaks to maybe what Cassandra was saying is, maybe the reason is because it's a bunch of people like me working on these things who weren't, didn't even occur to them that might be a problem. And it is a problem. And as I'm saying, these things are used in so many different systems. So for example, it might be used to classify what job we advertise to somebody based on the text on their webpage. And we had a system that, just to illustrate, that does this. So here's a bio from somebody's webpage. it predicts that this person is a teacher, she's a teacher. And if you change all the gender pronouns from she, her to his and she to he, all of a sudden it predicts that she's an attorney. Again, that's rooted in basically, I'm not going to tell you how this works, but that's rooted in the same problem that the numbers that it associates with different words have these strong gender biases. And just the last thing I want to say is that you can also see racial biases here. If you can look in the word embedding and cluster things based on names and first names, and you'll have clusters that are different races, different ages, different ethnicities. And then the word embedding will also spit out its biases here, and it'll have biases. It can do it by groups, by foods, and it has biases. So for example, my partner Yael here associated with kosher and hummus and bagel, but other groups have different biases. But more problematic is this also when you get to professions. Again, we see that some groups have very negative biases. You don't want to be you don't want the computer to think that you're a smuggler or a stripper or something just based on your name. But people were using these things just without even, without thinking that, oh, they're just based on data, therefore it must be okay. And obviously it's not. So that's just an example of how you can kind of go awry without thinking about, with it just, using these things. I don't think people had bad intentions usually when they were using them, but they just designed an algorithm, it kind of worked. And then now we realize that there may be a lot of problems associated with using those algorithms.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Adam. I think that's like, I have a real reaction when I see that, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure lots of us do. And I think what you're saying, two things come up for me. One is, it's actually really helpful to see how a computer does this, because a computer doesn't hide behind a veneer of language, right? Or of propriety. So these are kind of human biases revealed, right? Which is helpful. And then it makes me actually think, the second thing it makes me think is of a comment that Cassandra made earlier, which was around when we just say data and we rely on data in the absence of thoughtful questions that we start with. That's when we kind of find ourselves in like going down a dangerous path. And so as we think about guardrails that we can set up for ourselves and how we can have foresight, I just would love to hear from both of you, just to open it up, to say, what are ways that we can have foresight in this? What are guardrails that we can set up that we can know, hey, this is a powerful technology, but this is obviously a flagrant example. But how can we structure these guardrails in a thoughtful way? What are efforts you've seen to do that, both of you, that you've been impressed by?
So it's very hard, I think, to give a complete set of guardrails, I would say, because there's a lot of problems that can come in from different angles. But one very basic thing that I think has been talked about today is the data. The source of data, of course, they use it. And the word embedding example, of course, they're using data that's based on even news articles, which might sound innocuous, or Wikipedia, but actually can contain a lot of bias. But, so there's definitely been suggestions where every time you use a data source, you should have a data sheet associated with that. And that's some nice work coming out of our sister lab, Microsoft Research New York, by Hannah Wallach, Tim Jabru, and others. And here, for example, I know Neil's here. Neil Heffernan has a project where they use, in the system, it's their system, they use crowdsourcing. They, instead of using just public data, they use data from teachers that are giving feedback to students. That's an example of maybe more appropriate data for a certain domain. But in general, you have to be very careful about the data, but that's only one small aspect of the whole process that I think is worth mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add, I love the way that Adam laid out word embedding and the bias inherent in it. I really appreciate Ajoy, you and Paula, even in the chat, talking about this is really a reflection of the bias in society that's showing up in these algorithms, right? So it's not that the algorithm or the practice is bias, but it's revealing to us bias. I think a powerful guardrail or a powerful practice that I have seen is that when we explicitly talk about diversity and bias, instead of sort of trying to put up a screen of objectivity, then we're able to address it, right? I'll get even more concrete. At the Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity, we work with teacher prep programs to make issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion explicit in teacher training. We all believe that all children can learn, but by saying all children can learn has not historically equipped our teachers to deal with diversity and difference in the classroom. And so when we see studies of first-year teachers, they say, well, we don't know how to grapple with all of this diversity. We don't know how to leverage identity. We don't know how to connect with families and communities because teacher prep hasn't been explicitly preparing them to do so. Again, my tie here is that if in the world of AI for education, we can start with the perspective of there's bias in the system, right? And we can begin to confront on the front end in the design phase how we're going to mitigate the bias that exists in our society, as opposed to pretending that words and numbers are objective. Then we stand the real opportunity to correct, perhaps, or at least to design around perhaps some of the bias in the system. I think it's critically important that that the field of AI is holding up those examples as clear and as simple and as easy to digest as Adam just did, so that we don't have to deal with the objection of, well, these are just words, or these are numbers, or it's not objective. So given that it's not objective, how do we design, right, a more fair, impartial, equitable, accountable system? And I know that's a bigger lift, but it feels more authentic. And I love, again, what Jim put in the chat around, this moment of interdisciplinary, intersectional, intercultural conversation and work and design in this space, so that blind spots can be caught, hopefully on the front end, but if they're unintended, let's address them, as we move forward.
I think that's really good. So as you were talking, Cassandra, what was and as Adam was showing us the example, it's what we have the potential to do with AI is to reveal bias in our system so that we can address it, right?
Absolutely.
So one of the things that comes up for me is, college enrollment, right? Or course matching or under matching. And we see these patterns, like, with Raj Chetty's research, we see how mobility in America is kind of a myth, right? And how is it that, how is it that there's so little movement between different tiers of our society? And we sort of look at that data in aggregate in a static way, and we say, wow, this is problematic. I think what AI gives us the ability to do is in our real-time systems now, start to interrogate data, start to interrogate these biases and surface them in more real-time ways, right? Just like Adam showed us.
Yeah.
And so it's not about pointing fingers at people, but it's about understanding kind of systematic injustice, right?
Right.
And surfacing that. And so that's something that this technology, when well used, gives us the ability to do that we've never quite had before, right?
Absolutely.
And so, my question for you both is, and maybe coming back to you for a second, Adam, like in terms of your team, I think it's important to recognize and go back to that moment when your team saw that information. Right. There's a whole bunch of ways that y'all could have gone about looking at it or addressing it. And so what was true in your team that this is the way that you all chose to interact with the information and the data and the direction of the research that you were taking? What are some of the lessons that we can learn from that we can, bring to other teams that are looking at data, right? That are using these kinds of algorithms, that are designing them. And then we'll come back to you, Cassandra, because I'm sure you've got thoughts on it too.
Well, as I said, I was lucky to be in an interdisciplinary lab where we had these social scientists in the first place talking about problems that exist in society. Honestly, I probably wouldn't have thought of asking that question in the first place if I wasn't around them and watching talks by them. So that was kind of a fortunate situation for me. One thing I think is neat that might be relevant that Cassandra was talking about is, as you say, there's just so much bias in society. And sometimes what happens is when you think as an AI researcher, okay, well, if I want my algorithm to be fair, what's the metric? How will I know if it's fair? What would that even mean? It's very hard to define. But once you start thinking about that, there's an opportunity to take some of that back to the humans and say, okay, so if you try to make an algorithm that's going to make decisions, like a judge would, and you say, okay, well, this is what I mean by fairness, you can actually then, force people to define what they would want from a human judge. And you can look at the human judges and say, hey, are they meeting this criteria? Let's see how they're systematically biased, just like the AI. We don't expect them to be unbiased. We don't think, humans are unbiased and the AI is biased. Both of them are biased. And so it can sometimes help maybe think about what the right definitions are. I guess that's the question. I don't have an answer, but it can force lawyers and policymakers to think about what are the right definitions. Because if I need to design an algorithm to make supposedly be fair in some way, you have to say what fairness is, and then we can throw that back at the humans and say, well, first of all, are you being fair under these definitions as well? So I think I'm expecting that there'll be kind of there'll be a deep dive into what we think of fairness, a better understanding quantitatively in terms of what we think human fairness is as well.
Yeah, I mean, I love that concept, Adam. And I almost think, like, isn't that the right push for us to get more precise around what we think is fair and to have a system of accountability around that, right? Both as we're designing tech, but also leveraging tech as a mirror on human existence and thinking more deeply about those questions. I think that's powerful, absolutely powerful. The other thing, though, I would want, and I really appreciate what your interdisciplinary team did as you sort of discovered this, right? And then you asked, so what, now what, right? And I would argue there might have been folks who looked at those same words and thought, seems right to me, and didn't have necessarily a filter of reflecting on that information as biased, right? I think there's still a lot of equity literacy that we're doing in across our country. And so, in recognizing that there was bias in the system, having some sense of, okay, now what do we do about it? I could see that be a set of rules of engagement around it as well, and fodder for the community to think about how are we establishing sort of not just accountability measures, but even a set of appropriate actions that can help think about or guide sort of what do you do with it next? How do you interact with it next?
Yeah, so there's this, it's kind of like a code, right? Yeah. A code of ethics, or I think, Adam, you alluded to the law, right? And how law and policy, that's the role of law and policy. Or in medicine, we have, the Hippocratic Oath. There's sort of this idea that with science and technology has to be paired policy and a justice-oriented policy, right? And ideas of fairness become very, very important. Mm-hmm. I think something Tess talked about in the video just prior to us joining was the importance of education, right? And so starting at the very beginning, getting children to interrogate these ideas and grapple with, and she talked about ethics being a core part of like the curriculum they have children go through, children and young people and college students, so that questions of AI are never divorced from questions of ethics, right? And so I think that's a powerful, to always be, whether it's in the research phase, in the education phase, in the development phase, always sort of have that thread of what is ethical, govern, and offer guidance. I think feels like a really critical critical need. Maybe I know we're going to run up on time, and I'm not seeing a ton of questions come through on the chat. So maybe I'll ask this for us to close out, which is, for each of you, if you could advise sort of like one powerful stakeholder that has a voice in sort of the development and trajectory of AI. We could give them, you could choose the stakeholder and you can give them advice. Who would you choose and what advice would you give them?
So I'm going to jump in, if that's okay. The stakeholder, I guess, group that I would choose would be the developers. And the one thing that I would say that I've said before is, how can technology augment and extend, particularly in education, the work of a teacher, as opposed to replace, and to grapple with really clearly what is the problem that AI is helping to solve in that scenario. I know I said one piece of advice. The second one would be don't work in a silo. We all have blind spots from our own sort of training and perspective, and the more diverse perspectives you can bring to the table, I do think the stronger the outcome. So that's my two quickies.
Thanks, Cassandra.
I guess I would also speak to developers, because that's a group that is easiest for me to communicate with. And I would say that they just have to be, it would be great if we could have more diversity, more conversations. And, it's good for us to be engaged and coming to panels like this, listening to other people, hearing what's on people's mind as we develop software so that we can hopefully, make it meet all the needs that we have.
That's awesome. I'll cheat and I'd pick two. I would pick people who are sort of technology futurists and investors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who I think we're really excited about technology. I'll count myself as one of them. We get really excited about technology and sometimes forget the problems of humanity that we want to solve or address, or we should address. And I would tell them, pay attention to the problem or the challenge, and that challenge first, technology second. I think the other group, similar to what you're saying around the developers, I think having a view of yourself that you're not just a software engineer or an AI developer, you're like part of a profession that has a code, right? And hold yourself to that high standard that your trade is being done in service to the world, in service to humanity, and it just orients people differently than sort of. I think doctors and teachers have that, and I think AI developers have that too. So I know we're running up on time. Cassandra, Adam, thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation, and we'll hand it back to Paul Kim.
Thank you.